Hi, I'm Mark from Kicker Software, and today I'm going to be showing you how you can use Kicker to analyse a hand of poker. I'm going to analyse a hand of poker that I myself played a few years ago and see if perhaps I maybe made some mistakes while I played it. This video is going to last about 20 minutes. And we're going to cover at a fairly high level what you can do with the software. There will be further videos that go into more detail on some of the subsections that I'll go through quite quickly today. And actually, if you check the website out by the time you watch this video, they may be available as well. But this is going to be a high level pass through it. Just to be clear as well, this video isn't really about trying to teach you how to play poker, or really about the decisions that I took either 3 years ago or the decisions I might take today using the software. It's more about showing what the software can do. And it also assumes you do have a basic understanding of certain poker concepts like ranges and position and things like that. So it's not for absolute beginners, but if you've been playing poker for a little while, you should be able to follow what we're talking about. So the first thing I'm going to do is think about pre-flop ranges. So that's a really important concept in poker, and it's something that Kicker can help with. So first of all, I'm going to go to the pre-flop range builder, and I'm going to demonstrate. This is the hand I'm going to analyze was a hand where I opened from the button pre-flop and the villain called from the big blind. And this is the range that I've determined that I had in that situation. If we just go to this screen here, this is the pre-flop player pool tendencies, and we can see, because this is actually an analysis at a hand history level based on hundreds of thousands of hands of poker, and you can see that it's saying that the opening frequency for the button is 46.5%. That's for the player pool that I'm playing against here. That's when it's six-handed as well. Now you can see here that the percentage of total starting hands in this range is about 35%. I'm just going to go to this screen as well. This is the hand history tool. What this tool allows you to do is have a look at certain situations. So I'm going to go six-handed and I'm going to go button, and this is actually what my real opening range was in reality. The time I was playing this hand based on hand histories. You can see that everywhere where there's darker colours, they are hands that I opened with 100% of the time. So whenever I was dealt these hands and it folded around to me on the button, pocket twos, pocket threes, pocket fours, and so on, all these ones that are kind of deep purpley blue colour, they are hands I opened with 100% of the time. Some of these other ones that are slightly more off colour that I opened with some of the time, but not all of the time. These ones that are kind of grey, only opened with a very small proportion of the time. And the ones that are white or very light blue, I didn't open with ever. Do have this threshold slidey bar here where you can start to eliminate some of the hands you very rarely opened with, just to try and help nail down the range. So I use that as a starting point, and then I've used it to craft what I think is probably a reasonable range based on the kind of hands I opened with, and also with an eye to maybe trying to exploit the player pool by opening slightly tighter than the other players, but you could use these tools to do this however you like. So that's my button opening range. We also need to think about the big blind calling range. And how I've constructed this is, again, using this same subscreen. If we look at when there's an open from the button, you can see that the calling frequency for the big blind from the button, when there's a button open, is 39.6%, and the raising frequency is 10.2%. That's for the player pool. And this is based on a reasonably statistically significant sample of hands. I mean, we've got, you know, tens of thousands of hands that we're looking at that were in that exact spot, 27,000 hands. So we can see that number there. So I've used that as a basis. I'll just go through it again briefly here. You can see you use these slidey bars here. You can say I'm going to use this slidey bar here. It uses the Sklansky-Carlson hand rankings. And let's take that up to like 49 point something percent. And then we'd say, well, we're going to raise about 10% of those. So you can see we're going to raise about 10% and we're going to call about 39.5%, which is roughly the numbers that we saw when we looked at the player pool tendencies. So we'll craft that as the big blind calling range. Right, so now we're going to actually look at the hand. So if we go back to the hand history summary, and we go to this screen here, this screen, because we selected button on the previous view, it's going to show us all of the hands where we were on the button, and we opened and we got a call from either the small or big blind, but just from one of them. And then we went to the flop and we had the opportunity to continuation bet. and then you can see kind of what happened. You can see what the final street was, and you can see how many big blinds ultimately you won or lost in the hand. We can see this hand here. I think it's an interesting one to analyse because I had ace 6 offsuit, and the flop came 4 ace 10. I was on the button. The final street was the river, so we got to the river, and I lost 27 big blinds. So let's have a look at this hand here. There's the flop. There's the hand I had. Here are the two ranges. It's already picked them because it knows that I was on the button and the villain was in the blind. You can see the stack size is 46. That's the effective stack size, 46. And the pot had 6.5 in, and the hero, myself, was in position. So I'm now going to click Analyze. We just put a name in for this scenario. And it now takes us to the flop. Now, the first thing to note is that we are looking at the villain's situation here, first of all, because the villain is out of position. And therefore, the villain gets to act first on the flop. You can see here we've got a bunch of equities. We've got the hand combos, and then we've got equities here. So how much value is that hand going to have by showdown on average? The improvability, so actually this hand is going to get worse by showdown. It's currently a set of 4s, very strong, but there obviously are cards that could come that would undermine it, such as if a flush comes in and the opponent's got a flush, etc. The nuts equity is what are the chances that this hand gets to showdown and is the best hand and is a very strong hand, like minimum 3 of a kind. And you can see this is already 3 of a kind, so this has nuts equity of 90.7. But if we were to scroll down, like actually if you look down here, you've got ace 4, which is 2 pair, but its nuts equity is only 15.6% because that's only its chances of improving to a full house by the river, I think there. Otherwise, it's just considered 2 pair, which isn't considered to have nuts equity. And we also have the percentage of time the hand is bet. At the moment, we haven't picked any of the hands to bet, so they're all 0. And how often these hands are in the range, because these hands don't always have to be in the range at 100%. It could be that pre-flop you decide you were going to open with the hand 50% of the time and maybe fold with it 50% of the time. Or if it was a calling range pre-flop, you might decide to call with it some of the time, raise with it some of the time, and therefore it wouldn't always be in your calling range. Situations like that. So we have to decide what we are going to do with the villain's range here. It's worth just bearing in mind as well, the reason why the villain doesn't have pocket aces and pocket 10s here, or ace 10, is because if we look at the villain's range, the villain would have re-raised all of those hands. So they don't have them here now. But they do have some very strong hands. I'm going to assume, just for the purposes of this analysis, that the villain checks 100% of the time here. Sometimes players do check 100% of the time when they are out of position and they've called from the big blind and they just relinquish control to the pre-flop aggressor. So I'm going to say that the villain just checks their entire range. So I click check. We now go to the action moves on to the hero, and the hero, myself, has more strong hands here. Lots of sets, 2 pair combos, and we can see that the hero bet 3 big blinds. So I think the first thing we're going to do is we're going to pick the hands that the hero would have bet here. And I think I'm going to use some of the filters here. So I'm going to turn all of the hand strength indicators off, which means we've currently got nothing in the list. And I'm going to turn on all monsters and all strong hands. So I'll just turn strong off for a minute. You'll see monsters is all sets and 2 pair combos. So we'll bet all of those, and then we'll turn on the strong hands as well. And that is, I mean, strong hands in this context here are all ace high hands. It would also include any overpairs, but because there's an ace on board, there aren't any overpairs in this particular situation. So we'll bet those as well. You can see we've already got 38% of hands. Let's reset all the filters. I think in this situation, we would also bet all our flush draws. So let's turn everything off and the flush filters, and then just turn flush draws on. Let's bet those. That takes us up to 44%. I think in this situation as well, we would bet all of our gut shots. So let's turn that off, turn gut shots on, and let's bet our gut shots. That gets us up to 57% here. Now, something that I find quite useful in this kind of spot is to now look and see what is the weakest hand that I'm checking. Sorry, what's the strongest hand that I'm checking? And that is pocket kings. I'm checking pocket kings. I'm checking hands like king 10, which is second pair, pocket queens, and so on. I'm checking those hands. Possibly might want to bet those. Another thing you might want to do is check some combos of your very, very strong hands just to add a bit of strength to your checking basket. For the purposes of this demo, I'm not going to do that. And just to reiterate what I said at the start, the purpose of this demo is not to tell you the best way to analyze your hands or the best way to play your hands. It's just showing how the software can help you make these decisions by giving you things like equities and filters and also player pool information. Another thing that I might do here, if I was analysing this hand, is I would have a look and I would see, okay, I'm going to sort by reverse equity, and I'm just going to pick a bunch of hands down here that are quite weak, like very weak, don't really have much equity, maybe have a little bit of improvability, but don't have much nuts equity, just because they just don't have much showdown value, just to pad out my betting range. So I'll pop them in, that takes it up to 68%. You can see here that 35% of all my combos are in my checking range and 65% are in my betting range. And you can see that the equity strength of my betting range is 68%, and my equity strength of my checking range is 56%. There's not a massive disparity between those two. So I have left some strength in my checking range, and I've got some weakness in my betting range. You can actually have a look at what these ranges look like as well by clicking on that bar. You can see, obviously, I've only got partial combos in here because some of them are not bet all of the time, and some of them don't have as many combos because of what's already on the board. And you can see the same for this here with the green background. What's also worth looking at here are the equity distributions. Just before we go ahead and make this bet, you can see that currently this is a histogram that shows how many hands we have in each sector of this. So if we look at this here, this is the hands that have 80 to 85% equity, and we've got loads of them. We've got 65 of these. That's 17% of our entire range. 12% of our entire range has even more, and 5% has even more still, you can see. Whereas the villain has quite a lot of hands that just don't have as much equity as the hero's hands here. We can also have a look at nuts equity too, which shows us how many nutted hands we've got. And we've currently got a bunch of hands that have nutted equity here. They'll be all the sets. And as we know, the villain's only got one combo of the sets, the pocket fours. And this purple section here are the draws on the flop. So you can see we've got similar numbers of draws. We're slightly ahead. We have an equity advantage here of 27% and a nuts advantage of 4%, with an improvability of -7%. So given all of that information, I think this is a reasonable range for us to use for our betting range. So we bet 3 big blinds, and it now comes back on the villain. Let's just have another look at those equities. You can see we're now even further ahead because we've skewed our range to a lot of value and then some bluff and some draws in the middle. But we're even further ahead of the villain now. We've got 35% equity advantage and 8% nuts advantage and 0% improvability, which is interesting. And it's now on the villain. And so we need to decide what the villain is going to do. And actually, we can see from the scenario that the villain raised to 6 big blinds. So the hands the villain, I think, would do that with, for sure. They're going to do that with their very strong hands, their sets and their 2-pair combos. So let's pop them in their raising range. We've got 3% in their raising range. Now, one thing that's worth bearing in mind is that the villain is going to raise a certain percentage of their hands, but at the moment we're not really clear what percentage of the combos that the villain has they're going to re-raise with. However, we have this tool here, which is the player pool tendencies for the flop. And we can see that on average, whoever the aggressor is bets just less than half pot, which would be within this section here, where the aggressor bets between 40 and 60% pot. On average, you're going to get a call 48% of the time. You're going to get folds 43% of the time, and you're going to get raised 9% of the time. But that's just for an average flop. We can actually go better than that, and we can apply the texture of the actual flop that we saw here. So we apply that texture, but what we have here is this has taken the 4 of hearts, ace of spades, 10 of spades, and it's filtered based on that criteria. So it's a flush draw, it's a straight draw, it's got 2 Broadway cards, and it includes an ace, so it's an ace high board. And we just get slightly more nuanced information here. We see the call is still 48%, but the fold is 44%, and the raise is 7% when you bet around about half pot. So 7% is the figure that we're looking for. So we've currently got 3%. We've got the very strong hands. I think that the villain might make this move with some of their draws as well. So let's just turn off flush draw filter and then turn it on. And let's filter on nut flush draw. So I think they would probably raise all their nut flush draws. Let's reset the filters again. Let's go back to flush draws again, because I think there are... Actually, let's reset all filters and just filter on and sort on nuts equity here, because there's some very strong hands here the villain's got. It's not the nut flush draw, but Queen Jack of spades is both a gut shot and a flush draw. And And then queen, four of spades is a flush draw with two different possibilities of runner straights. And there are a bunch of hands like that that have fairly strong equity. So let's include all of those and add those to the raise range. That takes us up to 6%. We'll maybe just add in a couple more of those. That gets us up to 7%, which was the figure we were aiming for. So I think this is a reasonable re-raising range for the villain. So let's make that happen by doing that bet. And now let's have a look at these histograms. And now you can see the villain's range is now starting to move ahead of us. They've got much stronger hands than us in this area, and we've got a bunch of hands that kind of just draw with the bottom of their range here, and we've got a lot of stuff towards the end. So we now need to decide as the hero what we're going to do. I think the first thing to bear in mind is if we just sort by equity here, that I think as the hero we would probably re-raise all of our sets here. What we actually did in the real hand was call, but if we say we would re-raise these hands, and then we have the hands that we would call with here. And I think we're going to probably call with a lot of hands. So let's just start with our ace high hands. I think in this situation here, if I'd been re-raised by the villain, and it was only, I bet 3, he re-raised to 6, I think I probably would call with all my ace hands, because the villain might well do that with just flush draws, in which case I'm ahead. So let's turn everything off and then put our strong hands on. We'll also put our monsters on as well. So we're calling with our ace high hands and also our 2 pair hands. I think that's fair enough to say we would call with those hands. So let's reset all our filters. And what are we left with now? I think we would also probably call. Let me just have a little scan down here. Yes, they're all our ace high hands. I think we would also call with our flush draws. So let's turn all our filters off, turn flush draw filters on, and let's call with those, because it's possible that the villain is also just doing this with an ace hand, and therefore our draws might well be good. Again, let's just check what the weakest hand that we're checking is here. So we've got some gut shots here. I think let's turn our gut shots on. Let's say we would call with our gut shots as well. Okay, so we're actually calling with quite a lot of our range here. Again, the purpose of this video is not to decide whether this is the right way to play this hand. It's just to show the benefit of what you can do. Maybe just call a gut shot with one street there. You might want to go through and pick up the gut shots that have backdoor flush draw equity as well. But in this case, let's just say the hero calls, and now we get to choose what the turn card is, and the turn card was the 4 of spades. So let's go along with that. Okay, and now we see a situation where, look how polarized this is now. We have some very strong hands right at the very top, but most of our hands are way weaker than the villain's range, and that's because we've had a very unusual situation happen here, where the turn card that's come is actually brilliant for the villain's range, as in it's brought in all their draws, and it's also paired the board in a way that turns some of their 2 pair combos, in fact the only 2 pair combos that they had, into monsters as well. Whereas what we're left with is a bunch of hands for the hero that, you know, there are various flushes and so forth that the hero has, but the villain just has far more going on here in terms of very, very strong hands, and therefore the hero's range is way behind. So we're on the villain again, and what happened is the villain checked. I think in this situation the villain might well check a lot of the time. Maybe they're going to bet some of these hands some of the time. So their pocket fours are now quads, and they have fewer ace-4 combos because there are 2 4s on the board and an ace. But let's say with these hands here that they might decide to bet those hands, let's say 50% of the time, which you can do with this. You can come in and say, I'm going to bet them 50% of the time. They might also bet some of their draws. So let's turn all the filters off, turn the flush filter on. So now they've got all of these made flushes, and let's say that they're going to bet those made flushes 50% of the time as well. So half the time they're going to bet their entire range, and half the time they're going to check their entire range. So if we say check, that means they take half of those combos forward. We're now on the hero, and I think the hero is going to probably bet their full house combos some of the time. So that's what we've got here. If we just reset all the filters, we've got all these ace-4 combos. So we're going to bet those, let's say 50% of the time. Probably bet some of the flushes as well. Let's just turn everything off and turn the made flushes on. Let's say we're going to bet our flushes 50% of the time as well, a bit like the villain did. We reset all filters, and then I think everything else our ace high hands, our 2 pair hands. I think maybe we just leave all of those and just check them behind. So if we say hero checks, and then the river card was 5 of hearts, and we know now that what happened on the river is that the villain bet 18 big blinds. And if we have a look at the villain's range is just absolutely replete with value hands here, and I think it's fair to say if we just whack the betting frequency up to 100%, that the villain is probably going to bet with their entire range here. So we select bet. Actually, no, we won't do it like that. We'll do it like this. We don't have to type the 18 in manually, but you could put a manual size bet in there if you wanted to and deviate from what happened in the scenario. And now we end up on the river where we've got full house combos. If we had the full house combos here on the river, I think the hero would re-raise with those, but I think everything else that's a flush, that's a made flush, so let's turn everything off, turn made flushes on, I think the hero would call with. Let's reset everything again. What are we left with? Well, we're left with a bunch of hands where if we think we've been accurate about the way that we've modelled the villain's range here, we've actually got a whole bunch of hands that have 0% equity. All of our ace high hands have 0% equity, and everything that's below that also has 0% equity. So therefore, you would think based on that you would not want to call with any of those hands. You possibly might want to re-raise with them if you think the villain is bluffing, but the way we've done this analysis, we don't think the villain has any bluffs at this point. So therefore, the hand we actually had, which has been here all along, ace 6 offsuit, is not a calling hand. And what I did in the real scenario a few years ago when I played this hand is I did call with this hand. So I think it's pretty clear, assuming that the way we've modelled this is correct, that that was a mistake to do that. Okay. Thanks very much for watching the video here. It's just a couple of other things I want to mention. When we use the player pool tendencies tool, some of you might be thinking, oh, well, I've got a heads up display, so I can use that, and I don't need to use this kind of player pool thing. But there are a couple of reasons why it's worth considering using the player pool tendency tool here. The first one is because you don't always have heads up display information on villains. You sometimes haven't got enough hands on them, so knowing what the player pool does as a kind of more general idea, I think, is very useful for when you don't have specific reads on players. It's a little bit like, if you were playing live in a casino and you maybe didn't have a read on the exact player, but you know the sorts of players that play in that casino. It gives you that kind of information. And also it gives you the information of knowing what bet size is, and how players respond to different bet sizes on what kind of flop textures. And I've never seen a HUD that can do that. It's possible that some very, very complicated HUDs are out there that do that, but I haven't seen them, and they're not widely adopted at the moment, even if they do exist. So it's worth using it for that purpose as well. And one thing I probably would do just after I've done this analysis here is I might well go back to some previous decision points, like say on the flop, and just maybe try looking in more detail at what the ranges were for the villain and the hero, and try and model things and look more deeply as to see whether or not it was a mistake to call with the ace 6 in that situation, because obviously I went through this quite quickly here. And one of the ways in which you can do that is by looking at the equities more deeply, and also maybe gaming out a few different possible turn cards, maybe turn cards that aren't spades, or maybe turn cards that are spades but don't pair the board, and things like that, just to have a look and see how that might make a difference to things. There are all kinds of ways in which you can use the software to do that. Well, thanks very much for listening and watching.